Developmental language disorder, or DLD, is a communication disorder that interferes with learning, understanding, and using language. The National Institutes of Health, the NIH, in the USA, says that DLD is one of the most common developmental disorders affecting approximately 1 in 14 children in kindergarten. To add to the confusion, over the years, DLD has also been called specific language impairment, language delay, or developmental aphasia. Is your child struggling in school? Not listening well? Perhaps unable to communicate what they mean? If these things are true for you, you will gain insights and strategies and a deeper understanding in today's episode. Welcome aboard. And also, share it with a friend. Does your child have a speech-language delay and you really want them to talk? Do difficult behaviors derail home life and you know the frustration is a communication struggle? Does your child see a speech therapist and you wonder, what do they do and how can I help? If these or similar questions are in your mind, this podcast is for you. Hello, my name is Dinalynn Rosenbusch. I am a speech-language pathologist that has worked with children from birth to 21 for 3 decades. And in my classrooms, I see you wanting to connect with the heart of your child, but their speech and language skills create a barrier. So if you have a kiddo that has difficult behaviors, needs to expand their language or learn to say speech sounds, and maybe even receives speech therapy, stay tuned, because in this podcast, you will learn how to use your daily life as a tool to communication practice and how to do that practice. You will become confident knowing you are making the difference you want to make. And you will hear success stories of parents who have navigated these struggles already. We'll do this all while focusing on building deep, meaningful connection and confidence in your kiddo. So grab a cup of coffee along with a notebook and pen. It's time to speak in the way your child's brain understands. And that is the language of play. Hey, I'm glad you're back. As a reminder, we are going to be switching over to do 1 episode a week for a length of time because I've been working on things and I just can't seem to get the headway that I want. And believe it or not, putting up an episode is not only the length of time of an episode, it takes a little while. And so I am going to switch to being 1 day a week for some time while I develop the multiple unfinished projects. If you have something you want me to address in an episode, I am so happy to. So email me at hello@thelanguageofplay.com. And the other thing is look back into the episodes. We've got episodes on many, many topics. It's a great arsenal. This episode is number 179. So you have almost 200 episodes to look through for the topic of your interest. And also, if you want to communicate with me or talk to me about working together, you can do it the same way. Email me at hello@thelanguageofplay.com. Now let's get started with this pre-recorded episode with Lois Letchford. Lois's dyslexia came to light when she faced teaching her son, Nicholas. Examining her reading failure caused her to adapt and change lessons. The results were dramatic, and Lois qualified as a reading specialist using her non-traditional background, multi-continental experience, and passion for assisting other failing students. Lois received teaching degrees in Australia, Texas, and a master's degree from SUNY, New York. She has written a book, and her first book is a memoir. And in this story, she details her dyslexia and the journey of her son's dramatic failure in 1st grade. So, Lois, thank you for being here on the Language of Play and sharing your experience with our listeners. We know that dyslexia is a common question, but what many people don't know is how dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. And the people that are listening here are often really wondering about how to build language. So let's start with you telling your story and sharing your experience.
Thank you for having me. I just love this podcast that you're doing.
I love your accent.
Thank you. You know, my story started before I even knew it had started. And that was that my son had ear infections from the ages of 8 to 18 months, pretty well constantly. And I knew there was a problem. I didn't know the impact it would have on his hearing and his language. No one explained that to me.
Yeah, it makes a
So,
difference, doesn't it?
and I spoke to a speech therapist, no, a hearing person, and she said it's not only when the child is actually not hearing, but leading up to it, the hearing is distorted, and coming out of it, the hearing is distorted, so they're not hearing clearly. So hearing becomes an issue. And what I didn't know is that I believe it actually, that's not true. I know it actually changes the brain because you don't have input in language.
That makes complete sense because our brain builds wires and fires and all of that in the way that it experiences the world. Through our experience, that is how we build our framework of understanding. So if your child is not getting clear inputs, they're building their framework based on the inputs that they're getting.
And the input he was getting, you know, he was always getting language, but not hearing it, but he was very good at puzzles. So the puzzle component of his brain is multiplying. Okay, so he goes to school, and this was in 1994, and he was terrified of going to school. And at the end of the first week, I spoke to the teacher, and she just threw up her hands and said, well, you know, I don't know how I'm going to teach him. He's so far behind, I don't know what I can do. And he just stares into space every day.
Ugh, what a terrible thing to say to a mama.
I knew that he wet his pants and he bit his fingernails. What I didn't know was that then that teacher shouted at him for every single day of the year, made him feel terrible. So then you do the standard route. You do the testing, and the testing reveals he could read 10 words. He has no strengths. And above all, he has a low IQ.
That's devastating.
Absolutely devastating. And it's actually really difficult to get out of that basket.
When you
And
say basket, do you mean the situation that you were in?
yes, in the basket of non-reading, very little hope. He's not going to learn. Just do the best you can. It doesn't matter because he's not going to learn. And that was the message that I got very clearly. Except I have a husband who's a professor. And when I took the results from this testing home, he said to me, Nicholas can look like that on any given day, but that's a lower bound. And it allowed me to put the testing in another basket and say, okay, but let's do other things. Now, we're a privileged family. And as I said, my husband's a professor. The following year.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you for just a second to highlight what you just did, because this is, I think, important for all parents to realize. When those tests come back, sometimes the tests are a snapshot of the given day. And whether they are or not, we need to put them into a different basket and do other things. And that's what you said. So I just really want to highlight that because that is truly what we need to do. I mean, even if you get a medical diagnosis, obviously you're going to follow through with it, but you take those results and you put them in a basket, so to speak, and you do other things too, you know, like you will be feeding and clothing and loving on in different ways, maybe, whatever it is.
Absolutely.
Okay, so sorry, I wanted to highlight that. Now continue.
No, it's perfect to highlight that. Very important. And so we went to Oxford the following year.
And tell us why you went to Oxford, because this is a cool story. I just know this.
My husband's a professor and he had study leave there. So he had study leave and the family go with him for 6 months. So we just have this family time. I send the eldest one to school so that I can have time with Nicholas, and I sent the youngest one to kindergarten 3 days a week. And my in-laws were with us. So then I could actually, at a time, teach Nicholas one-on-one in a quiet environment with no distractions. There was 1 ounce of distraction, I lost Nicholas.
Yes.
So we did that. And then I take this series of books with me called Success for All to teach Nicholas to read. It's got decodable
for altered teaching.
Success for All, ALL.
Okay.
You know, it's going to teach
Success
100% of children. Yes.
Okay.
single words on a page, no pictures, no connections. Nicholas read the words, got to the bottom, started again, and back to, it was zero. He had zero memory for that stuff. And my mother-in-law was with me, and she said, Lois, put away what's not working and make learning fun.
Jackpot. Make learning fun. Highlight that one too.
And at that time, you know, my stress levels were through the roof because I knew I wasn't getting through to Nicholas. And I needed input to make that change because my brain was just going on a downhill. And with her words, then I was able to stop and think, well, what can he do? Okay, he can rhyme words, and he was very good at seeing patterns. What can I do with that? I can write a little poem. And I did. I wrote one little poem. When I brought it to him, I read the poem to him. We read it together. We found the rhyming words. We created a picture. And he loved it. And he relaxed. And instead of having the shoulders up near his ears, he's relaxing.
Good.
And because one poem worked, you do another and another. And every day there was an enjoyment and an excitement in learning that wasn't there before. Then, you know, and I'm doing this day in, day out. I was given a series of books called Hear It, See It, Say It, Do It, which is about the decoding component. And that series of books dealt with short vowels. It dealt with the digraphs, TH, SH, and CH, and short vowels, and then the consonant blends. That's all it did. But the way it was doing it was hands-on. We made word puzzles. We had fun with it. Nicholas could do it.
Yay.
And then we have double O come up because I'm back. I'm flitting between the decoding and the whole of writing poems. The poetry, the double O comes up, and I write a poem about Captain James Cook. Now, you may or may not know he was the last of the great explorers, and he completed the mapping of Australia in 1770. And I wrote this little poem. Captain Cook had a notion. There's a gap in the map in the great big ocean. He took a look without the help of any book, hoping to find a quiet little nook. So you've got the rhyming words, you've got this tiny little poem, but the ideas within the poem are phenomenal. And it gives you a basis for talking and discussion. That's the language. In a place where Nicholas is safe and learning. So we get maps of the world and we start exploring maps of the world. And one day Nicholas said to me, can I see Captain Cook's original maps? And it was the time when I thought, that question doesn't come from a child with a low IQ. It's number one. And then he said to me, now, who came before Captain Cook's? And Smarty Pants here says, oh, well, that's easy, Nicholas. That was Christopher Columbus. And he said to me, and who came before Columbus? And I'm blown away because I haven't even thought. My world stopped before Columbus.
So you're thinking this is definitely not a child with a low IQ.
And I think I needed to see that as well as and experience it. And while we're in Oxford, you know, we're experiencing so many things because what was fascinating once we started to explore Columbus and who came before Columbus, I found it was a guy who had lived in Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria at the time was the major center of the world. And he drew the world's first map. He put north at the top of the map, which we still do today. And he never left the shores of Alexandria. And yet he talked to sailors and drew this map. And his name was Ptolemy. And while we are in Oxford, you know, one of the centers of the educational world, we go to the Bodleian Library and say, you know, where would we find a Ptolemy map? And the lady reaches around behind the counter at the gift shop and said, this book has just come out, and hands us a huge book of Ptolemy maps, published in 1995. And it'll be £5. I'm still gobsmacked at what happened. But now Nicholas is drooling over these maps, and we're looking at what did he get right? What did he get wrong? I wonder how he did. Amazing. And the most amazing component of all of this, was that Columbus's map, his latest map, was the Ptolemy map drawn 1,000 years prior to his expedition.
Oh, wow. Go figure. That's amazing. So when Nicholas saw that, I imagine that just brewed plenty of curiosity in his brain.
Unbelievable curiosity. I'll talk about that later. And all of the implications for that and what it did really, and this I think I can say here, we talk about teaching reading as being letters and sounds, and only letters and sounds, and structured literacy. What we ignore is why we're doing it. These letters and sounds were so hard for Nicholas, but they were the knife and the fork to information. And he needed the information, so he needed the knife and the fork to eat it.
What a great visual to understand it like that.
It's mind-blowing.
It is. You say that that is the language, like the poem is the language, and you talk about him not processing language real well. Now, that leads me to think of multiple meaning words. I bet you had some trouble with that.
That was mind-blowing. I'll continue with the story and come to that because we returned to Australia and I speak with the diagnostician who'd done the testing 12 months prior. And I just said, I'm so excited about all that Nicholas has done. It was such an exciting time, XYZ, it was fantastic. She stood in front of me, put her hands on her hips and said, well, I've spoken with the reading teacher and he has gone backwards. And in fact, he's the worst child I've seen in 20 years of teaching.
That's awful. I'm so sorry you had those kind of educational experiences.
And all I could do is walk away, not say anything. Takes me time to roll through all what she said. And I come back and I say, you can call him whatever you like, but if he is the worst child you've seen in 20 years of teaching, don't expect him to learn like everybody else. And then the next bit was just fascinating. The reading teacher sends Nicholas home with 10 sight words. He knows 8 of the 10 words. He doesn't know now, and he doesn't know the word saw. So we work on now. But then saw comes, and he's there. He stood in front of me with this little piece of white paper with 2 sentences on it. And he read, I saw a cat. And he stopped. And he went back and said, I was a cat. And he said, no. I had a cat, and I assert a cat. And he just threw up his hands and handed me the paper. The sentence the teacher had given him was, I saw a cat climb up a tree. And the second was, I saw a man rob a bank. It took me a while to work out what was going on in Nicholas's head and where this problem lies. Nicholas had never seen a cat climb up a tree, number one. The teacher has provided only the abstract meaning of the word saw. Nicholas is taking the concrete meaning of the word saw. I saw a cat, and he stopped because that doesn't make any sense.
Right. He's thinking of sawing wood or something like the tool, a saw, S-A-W. Yeah. And so in the sentence context, he's not going to saw a cat.
You
so
don't.
He can't
you don't
even read it. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. And that's interesting because now he knows the sentence has got to make sense. A sentence has got to make sense. So he had the foundations. And when it didn't, he didn't know what to do. And this is where we get into trouble, is the teacher would go back to her sentence instead of looking at what's the child seeing? What do I have to change? What do I have to do? How did I teach it then? I said to Nicholas, what did we see in England? And did we take a saw with us? You give them the concrete meaning in a situation of abstract. When we saw Captain Cook's original maps, did we take a saw with us? No.
So we are taking what he hears auditorily, and you're pairing it with the written word, you're pairing it with the concrete item, you're showing that the word means more than one thing in different contexts, calling attention to what you hear, what you see, what you smell, what you taste, and all the different things.
What you experience. What you experience. Yep.
Exactly.
My mouth is gobsmacked by all of it. But it really was the driver for me to become a reading specialist. And the paper that I read during this time was written by Professor Brian Camborne, an Australian educator, and he wrote the paper called Beyond the Deficit Theory. And in that paper, he said, when children fail to learn to read, the first thing we do is blame the child. We say, well, look at their IQ. look at their phonemic awareness, look at their background, look at this, look at that, look at the other. And what we fail to do is we fail to examine the teaching and what goes wrong with the teaching. And children fail to learn to read because we give them incomplete examples of how the written language works. What the teacher had done to my son was an incomplete example. And the second is because we give examples, but the child does not engage with them.
Sure. In the examples that you gave, saw was the same meaning in both. I saw a cat climb up a tree and I saw a man rob a bank. Both examples show saw as the past tense of see, but they're not showing saw as a tool that you use to cut with.
And you just said it, the past tense of the word see. As a speech therapist, you will know it. Developmentally, children do not say, I saw a cat. They might say, I sawed it, S-A-W-E-D, adding that E-D on, or I seed it.
Yep, they add the ED.
Yeah. If it's not in their oral language, it's very hard then to read it in written language.
That's the next thing I was going to call attention to that you said too, because you're saying that they're not noticing these things in written language, but we build our written language based on our oral language. And so, yes, we need to give these examples in conversation, call attention to these things in conversation before we even bother with the pairing of it, unless, of course, the child is old enough. But when kids are little, even with like my grandson, who's very little, I talk about a word and I notice that he uses a word wrong in context frequently. And so then I notice that word and then I say, yes, that word does mean that, but it also means this and it means this, and give him examples and play with it and grab items to walk through the experience with him. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Everything you said about reading is also true of oral language, and we need to do it regularly and often in oral language before we can ever expect it in reading and writing.
Nicholas had speech therapy because he had struggled with sounds, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And the past tense words were a problem. And it was the speech therapist who said to me, you've got to work on ED words. Now, this is the way I want you to do it. As you walk down the street, you say to him, I am walking. We are walking. Then you stop and you say, what do you say? We walk down the street. So it's the physical experience. I am opening the window. What did I do? I opened the window. And as I teach children, these problems are consistent with children who are age 9 and 10 who haven't understood how the written language works. They don't understand tense.
Mm-hmm. You are absolutely right. I'm so glad you're bringing this up. One thing you said to me before when we met was a phrase that I really liked. You said, curiosity propagates in the brain in untold ways. And I liked it so much that I wrote it down. Would you like to comment on that?
I would. Nicholas had an extraordinary life. You know, this first part was of going to Oxford really changed how we teach and how I taught him. And he went on to get a PhD in applied mathematics from Oxford University, you know, right out of the different from that 6-year-old who failed. And after he finished his PhD, I thought, I'd just like to talk to you, Nick. Tell me about what happened in first grade. My son cried. And that was the first time I recognised that trauma had occurred in grade 1 and I hadn't dealt with it.
So when he described what happened to him when he was 6 years old, as a 30-year-old man, he cried. So the trauma was there.
And still there. And not being able to put words to it, not be able to say anything. And I, you know, once we were over that, I ignored it, pretending it's gone. And you can't do that. And during this conversation, I thought, well, I can't deal with that now. But Nicholas, tell me what happened when you and I learned together in 1995. And instead of tears, we've got laughter. And he said to me, you wrote poems for me. You wrote Mug of a Bug and Windmill on a Hill. So 25 years after, he remembered the poems that I had written for him. And then he said to me, learning about Captain Cook and the changing mapping of the world, I learned to love learning, and I never want to stop learning. And it was then that I realized, that power of curiosity. When Nicholas asked the question that he asked, all I saw was a little question. What I didn't see was the brain and the neurons firing in an untold way that said, this is so exciting. And because he has a language problem, Nicholas eventually was diagnosed as being speech language impaired or developmental language disorder on the 2nd percentile. His asking one question like that just shows enormous thinking. And it's that thinking. You can't measure that. You can't put a number on it. It's easy to measure if the child has got 5 letters and 5 sounds. But that curiosity and the power that has is it not measurable. And that's what made Nicholas really grow. And asking, why do I need these letters and sounds? Yeah, well, this is so exciting and this is the best thing ever. And then you go back to the letters and sounds and you need a few more of them. And they become so important to access information.
This is good. Now, if I was listening to this as my listeners are, my next question would be, so does he read now?
Oh, yes. Oh, enormous.
He had to have in order to get his PhD.
Yes.
And I think your story is fantastic. Now, you have written a book on your story, right? Yeah. What is the name of the book you've written?
My book is reversed to memoir, so it's my story and his story. It's how we came to be. And, what's great about my story, which is really hard in another way, is that it starts with pain, and then you get the pluses, and then you get the dumps, and then you get the pluses, and then you get the fall down all the way through. And as people say about my book, they laughed and they cried. That's the biggest thing about my book. And I am by nature not a natural writer. I didn't write for years because I am dyslexic. So I had a lot of help. I had an editor, writer help me write that book in a way that is engaging for people. And that's the most exciting thing that I can do. And the
Congratulations.
Event, thank you.
Project to undertake.
I will get you a copy today.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading it. And we'll have the link in the show notes for Amazon, right? So that if anybody else would like to read your story in detail, then they can get the book there.
My book, I think, is really important because it's 2 components. One is the learning to read. The second component is going from the bottom to the top, because Nicholas, as an 11-year-old, was taking 5 minutes to read 1 page of Goosebumps. Incredibly slow reading. But he could comprehend it, but it was just amazingly slow. And my story shows the steps that were involved in taking this kid from the bottom to the top.
Love it. Thank you very much for sharing that story. And I'm proud of you for doing that. That is no small task. So good for you. And you obviously feel a tremendous amount of success, as you should. Thank you for being with us today on The Language of Play. And listeners, if you would like to read Lois's book, you can find the link in the show notes to purchase it online. And you can find more about her there as well, including how to contact her. Thank you, Lois, again, for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Hey parents, I hope you found this episode helpful. If so, would you please take 30 seconds and share it with a friend who also lives or works with children? I would really appreciate it if you would leave a quick review for the show on Apple Podcasts. I read every review, and it lights me up to know that this show is making a difference. Then come join my Facebook community, where you'll meet other parents who are dedicated to helping their children grow too. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thank you for joining me. Now it's time to go. Let's pop our kiddos in the strollers and go look around outdoors and see what we have to talk about.